A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I warmly welcome you all to the National Conference on the COP26 Charter of Actions, hosted by the Energy and Resources Institute, with support from the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, and in partnership with the British High Commission, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, and Tata Cleantech Capital Limited. The COP26 Charter of Actions is a knowledge document being prepared by TERI, which assimilates questions and challenges concerning key themes for India, such as equity, green finance, adaptation and resilience, nature-based solutions, energy, clean transport, and business and industry. We request all panelists to keep their mic on mute when not speaking and keep the camera on throughout the session. I warmly invite Dr. Vibha Dhawan, Director General TERI, to deliver the welcome remarks. Dr. Vibha Dhawan has been associated with TERI since 1985. She has also served as the Vice Chancellor for TERI School of Advanced Studies from 2005 to 2007. Additionally, she is a Fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, India. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nivedita, and heartiest welcome to all those who are present today. All the speakers, colleagues, participants who are joining online platform and YouTube as well on the soft launch of TERI's knowledge document, the COP26 Charter of Actions. The Charter includes cross-cutting themes consisting of equity, green finance, adaptation and resilience, nature-based solutions, energy, sustainable mobility, and business and industry. The message from latest IPCC report is also very clear. We need not be just have ambitious plans, but we need to act immediately. We don't have any time now. And the recent, whether it is floods in New York, Germany, or bursting of the natural calamities which are happening again and again in different parts of the world, clearly shows that we need to act urgently. As a result, the upcoming COP becomes extremely important. Successful climate negotiations at COP26 will further our fight against climate change. TERI believes that steering discussions around COP is imperative, and hence we are organizing this national conference on the key themes and issues around COP26. In the month of August, TERI organized 5 stakeholder roundtables discussion to gain inputs for the charter and seek validations on the key messages coming out of the chapter. I take great pride in announcing that the charter will be formally launched at COP26 in Glasgow on 6th of November at UNFCCC side event. Once again, I warmly welcome you all to the conference where we have lined up stellar speakers and who are best in their field. So welcome once again, and I look forward to having a fruitful discussion during this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dhawan. I now invite Ms. Natalie Toms, Counselor, Economics and Prosperity, Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, British High Commission. Ms. Toms took over as the Economic Counselor at the British High Commission in August 2018. She is responsible for the British government's engagement on economic, financial, energy and climate change issues in India, with a focus on creating partnerships between the two countries that will lead to mutual prosperity.
Super, thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Dhawan, as well. It's great to be here with you all today. Once again, here with TERI and here to this event to launch the COP26 Charter of Action. As Dr. Dhawan has said, we're at the threshold of an immensely important event. In less than 2 weeks, leaders from all over the world will be travelling to Glasgow in the UK for the UN's 26th Conference of Parties meeting on climate change. As host of this conference, the UK has been delighted to work with TERI over the last year on a series of stakeholder discussions and dialogues on a wide range of climate-related themes involving sector experts, scientists, economists, practitioners, civil society, academia, and youth. And it's great to be here today at the session, which represents the culmination of this work. Again, as Dr. Dhawan has said, climate change is here and it's real. The latest IPCC report presents a very troubling forecast for the world and for South Asia, predicting the region will see hotter weather, longer monsoons, and increased droughts as global warming increases in the next 2 decades. COP26 is going to be a pivotal moment for the world to come together to accelerate action on climate. It will be our last opportunity to work together to keep 1.5 degrees warming alive. That means to keep global warming to a minimum of below 1.5 degrees. And that is, and I believe that we can keep 1.5 degrees alive. And bodies such as the International Energy Agency have set out pathways which show us exactly how we can do that. But we do need to work together on it. In the UK, we've committed to a new nationally determined contribution, which sets out 78% emissions reductions by 2035 on a path to net zero by 2050. India is also taking important steps with its 450 gigawatts renewables target, national hydrogen mission, and international leadership through the International Solar Alliance and CDRI, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Of course, we understand different countries are going to have different pathways. We recognise the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, and we know that developed countries have a particular responsibility. That's why as COP host, we have doubled our own international climate finance commitment, and we've seen other countries also make significant announcements in recent weeks. It's also why we recognise the importance of continuing to work together on finance and on technology, research and innovation. We believe India has the opportunity to be at the forefront of a new global green transition with all the benefits of jobs and cleaner air that this brings. India has already reduced the emissions intensity of its economy, and we acknowledge India is starting from a very different position to the UK, with energy requirements set to increase. But most of the energy infrastructure that India will need by 2040 has yet to be built. There's a huge opportunity to use new tech to pioneer a clean development path. And we see Indian businesses already taking particularly exciting action, with Reliance committing to net zero carbon emissions by 2035, and the Mahindra Group of Wipro and others signing up to the UN's Race to Zero campaign. But we do also believe that formal commitments, including nationally determined contributions and long-term strategies for each country, will help collectively send a signal to each other and to global markets that will enable us to move faster together and keep 1.5 degrees alive. And as the UK, rather than as COP host, we also have a programme of collaboration with India on climate action. In fact, when PMs Johnson and Modi signed off on a new comprehensive strategic partnership and roadmap during the India-UK virtual summit in May this year, climate action was one of the 5 pillars of that strategy. We're already working together on many of the charter themes on clean energy, finance, adaptation, transport and nature, and look forward to continuing to do so. Finally, Alok Sharma, the COP president, has set out 4 goals for COP26. First, to put the world on a path to drive down emissions until they reach net zero by mid-century. Second, to protect people and nature. Third, to mobilise finance to tackle climate change. And finally, to work together by encouraging cooperation across borders and across society. He said, we want all voices to be heard, and particularly the voice of developing countries, to ensure that the transitions are fair and just. Our partnership with TERI is one such initiative that has provided a platform to advance discussions on it in this way and on these themes throughout this year. We really value the partnership and thank TERI for their leadership and contribution towards the COP agenda.
Thank you, Ms. Toms. We now have the ministerial address by the Honorable Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Government of India, Shri Bhupender Yadav. May we please have the video?
Ms. Vibha Dhawan, Director General TERI, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning to you all. It is a great privilege to address the important event, National Conference of COP26 Charter of Actions. I am happy to see the Energy and Resource Institute, popularly named as a TERI, work in preparing for COP26 Charter of Action. The document has taken a holistic approach touching upon issues closely aligned with India's priority areas, including on issues related to equity, energy, climate finance, adaptation and resilience, business and industry, and clean transport, all of which are important areas of drive climate action as far as India is concerned. I am confident that this initiative will provide direction for charting a course of equitable and sustainable climate action in India and for the world. Climate change is a defining issue confronting humanity right now. The impact of climate change are being felt globally. The need of the hour is a comprehensive set of actions within socio-economic and developmental context to deal with the issue of climate change. Concrete actions are needed in terms of cooperation between all countries, especially with developed countries taking a lead in climate action through mitigation, adaptation, and providing support to developing countries in terms of climate finance, capacity building, and technology transfer. The recently released report by IPCC has sounded alarm bells louder than ever, and it is a clarion call for the developed countries to undertake immediate deep emission cuts. India is committed, constituent to the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, and I am hopeful for a successful balanced outcome of COP26. India has taken several actions under the visionary leadership of our Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji to tackle climate change by taking several initiatives including inter alia implementation of National Action Plan on Climate Change, National Adaptation Fund on Climate Change, Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, faster adoption and manufacturing of electric vehicle in India scheme, setting up of International Solar Alliance, coalition of our disaster resilience infrastructure, leadership group of industry transition, and putting in place an ambitious national hydrogen mission and continuing effort to decouple its emission from economic growth. India has an aspirational target of installing 450 gigawatt of renewable energy by 2030. Indian Railways has set a target to becoming net zero carbon emitter by 2030. At the same time, ambitious climate action in developing countries is dependent on enhanced support for developed countries under the Paris Agreement. India has repeatedly called upon the developed countries to fulfill their promise of $100 billion per year goal. In this regard, COP26 should focus on climate finance in scope, scale, and speed, along with development transfer of technologies and capacity building support. Developing countries are highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. India's large population is dependent on climate-sensitive sector for their livelihood. The fight against climate change cannot be undertaken by the government alone. Private sector companies should be encouraged in developing breakthrough technologies and mobilizing finance. Equity and climate justice are touchstones of any global climate response. Mechanisms such as long-term strategies and global stocktake have to duly account for adaptation, finance, technology, and equity consideration. I thank you for your kind attention. Thanks.
Thank you, sir, for your inspiring words. Before we proceed, I request all the speakers to put on their cameras for a quick photo op. Thank you. I now invite Dr. Shelley Kedia, Associate Director, TERI, for facilitating the soft launch of the COP26 Charter of Actions and to present the key messages from the Charter. Dr. Kedia is the Associate Director of the Sustainable Development and Outreach Division at TERI, and she is leading the efforts on TERI's flagship Track 2 initiative, the World Sustainable Development Summit. She has been with TERI since 2009 and is a multidisciplinary professional who has more than 15 years of experience in policy research, advocacy, and capacity building. Over to you, Dr. Kedia.
Thank you, Nivedita. I will be sharing my screen, the presentation. can you please confirm if you are able to see the slides?
Yes.
Yes, it's visible.
Yeah, thank you so much. A very good morning to everyone who has joined us for the National Conference on the COP26 Charter of Actions. This year, no doubt, started on a note of optimism with the United States showing strong commitment and leadership on climate action under the Biden-Harris administration. The assessments made by the UNFCCC do not paint a rosy picture, and with the existing NDC commitments, we are set to breach the emission reductions mark needed to meet the 1.5 degree global goal and even the 2 degrees Celsius global goal by the end of this century. While revised pledges and assuming that they are fulfilled still give a glimmer of hope to realize the 2 degree global goal, considering the dire consequences of even a 2 degree Celsius, these existing efforts are highly inadequate. Much more is needed, especially from developed countries who should move towards being net negative by 2050 and not net zero. While India has low per capita emissions, it still remains a key player not only because of the aggregate potential to reduce GHG emissions, but also India being an actor as a lead market country and a country that can show normative as well as entrepreneurial leadership when it comes to international climate action. Coming to the COP26 Charter of Action, the Charter is TERI's efforts for rallying for an equitable climate agenda nationally and internationally. That is by engaging with actors at the national level as well as the international level. The Charter is an initiative under TERI's flagship Track to event, the World Sustainable Development Summit. The Charter is a knowledge document which will propose options which can advance climate action and ambition in India and globally. From the experiences of India, the document will also highlight the implications for the normative framework of the global agenda in terms of climate ambition and action. The approach for preparing the document is based on descriptive research as well as stakeholder consultations. As was also highlighted by Dr. Dhawan, 5 stakeholder consultations were held in August this year for validation and to get further inputs for the Charter of Actions. The outcomes of the COP26 and the messages from this charter will also be discussed at a plenary session at the World Sustainable Development Summit, which will be organized by TERI from 16 to 18 Feb 2022. So ladies and gentlemen, please block your calendar for those dates as well. I would like to also acknowledge our partners in this particular initiative. Of course, the organization TERI. We thank the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change for their constant support for this particular event and also for the World Sustainable Development Summit 2022 and in the past summits as well. We thank the UK government for being a country partner. We also acknowledge Bloomberg Philanthropies, Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, Tata Cleantech Capital, and more recently the Rockefeller Foundation, who have given support to complete this exercise. Just as a snapshot, the Charter covers 7 themes. First is on equity, climate justice, green finance, adaptation, resilience, nature-based solutions, business and industry, renewable energy, and sustainable mobility. The number of authors for the Charter was 36, and 9 reviewers, advisors are there. So a total of 45. It was an effort of total of 45 people. Coming to the first theme of equity and climate justice, the global stocktake is to take place at COP28 in 2023, and it is imperative that progress made by countries is assessed considering the principles of CBDR and equity well before the global stocktake. The terrain of equity from the perspective of a developing country needs to be framed more comprehensively than mitigation and would need to consider aspects related to adaptation, climate finance, and technology transfer. To ensure equity and climate justice, long-term climate actions need to consider both mitigation as well as adaptation, along with finance and technology needs. Article 7.2 of the Paris Agreement recognizes the role of adaptation in terms of long-term global response. to climate change. However, long-term strategies formulated and that are required to be communicated under Article 4.19 of the Paris Agreement only focus on mitigation, that is low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, and do not adequately consider adaptation. For an equitable global response, adaptation needs to be duly considered. India can assume the role of an entrepreneur leader by leading developments in breakthrough technologies and disruptive technologies, and is already a part of leading initiatives such as International Solar Alliance, CDRI, and LEAD IT. And in these initiatives, the R&D component or developing of breakthrough technologies can be taken up. Also, India can be a norm leader by building a shared understanding on sustainable consumption, adaptation, and non-anthropocentric notions around equity and climate justice. On the next theme of green finance, post-COVID recovery, in the short term, there is a critical need to lay the foundations of an enabling environment for green finance while building awareness and capacity of key stakeholders. What also came out from the stakeholder discussions that there is a need to distinguish climate finance from green finance. Climate finance is a subset of the latter and is a specific area of concern for climate negotiations. Decision-making processes for state budgeting and national budgeting in India have a potential to be more aligned to the NDCs and SDGs and use a green budgeting framework. TERI has already supported this exercise and thinking around this for the states of Punjab as well as Bihar. The global goals of financing need to be urgently realized, and the goal of $100 billion needs to be fulfilled. There is a need for well-defined mechanisms under the new collective quantified goal on finance. On the private sector, there is a need to mobilize green finance through ESG investing and also international finance. There is a need for transparency of information through disclosure standards in financial systems. On the next theme of adaptation and resilience, India should develop a national adaptation plan as per the provisions of the Paris Agreement. Research gaps need to be addressed by investing in science-based tools and building data sets. Moreover, the role of the private sector should be augmented in adaptation and resilience building apart from mitigation efforts. A crucial question regarding COP26 is whether COP26 will be an adaptation COP. Despite the inherent need of adaptation in strengthening climate action, a key area of concern remains the inability to quantify or map progress in absolute terms. In absence of such measures, momentum in addressing adaptation needs may be lost. On the next theme of nature-based solutions, the Charter specifically looks at the low-hanging fruit of agroforestry, and personally, I'm not too fond of the term nature-based solutions. But if we look at the tree outside forest cover in India, they form nearly 38% of the carbon sink in forest and tree cover in India. And thereby has a huge potential for contributing to climate stabilization. Agroforestry has a huge potential in India and can contribute more than 2 billion tons of CO2 equivalent by a reduction of CO2 equivalent by 2030 if the government puts in place appropriate incentive mechanisms for farmers or producers. At the global level, there is a need to further consider ecosystem-based approaches, considering terrestrial ecosystems, coastal ecosystems, as well as marine ecosystems, and expand and explore further the scope of blue carbon. Towards this, there is also a need for larger synergies between the provisions of all the three Rio conventions. On the theme of business and industry, the growing eminence of sustainability disclosures through SEBI and stock exchanges, and also the introduction of the business responsibility and sustainability reporting guidelines in India can motivate businesses to mainstream ESG and climate action efforts while strategizing their action plans, and also aid financial institutions like banks, credit rating agencies, and other financial institutions in investment decision-making. In the medium to long run, the role of industries in developing disruptive and breakthrough technologies, especially in hard-to-abate sectors, would be crucial. The private sector can be leveraged to enhance countries' adaptation efforts and build climate resilient infrastructure, complementing the goals of initiatives such as the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. On renewable energy, India has stepped up its renewable energy capacity targets to 175 gigawatts by the year 2022 and by 450 gigawatt by 2030. Apart from supply side measure, there is also need to boost demand for renewable electricity by pushing technologies such as electric vehicles. For power sector decarbonization, through large-scale deployment of renewable energy, viable energy storage alternatives will be needed to meet especially evening peak demand. To realize Goal 7 of the Sustainable Development Goals, along with large-scale renewable energy deployment, there is a need to raise awareness and deploy innovative models for ensuring energy access for improved livelihoods and well-being in rural areas through options such as distributed renewable energy. In terms of sustainable mobility, low carbon transport must be equitable and available for all and not just private vehicle owners. That is why any strategy towards sustainable mobility or low carbon transport must also duly consider non-motorized transport options as well as public transport options. A common fund for investment in low carbon transport infrastructure can be set up. In conclusion, again, would like to reiterate that the science is very clear and we cannot delay climate actions. Climate impacts are already being felt. India has many ambitious policies in place and there is much that India can do in terms of climate actions domestically. But India will have to assume a leadership role and rally the global community. The technologies out there are not sufficient for meeting the global climate goals. And we need more disruptive technologies to address the issue of removing the accumulated greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. There may be efforts to vilify India for not doing enough. However, initiatives such as the International Solar Alliance, CDRI, and Lead IT demonstrate India's entrepreneurial leadership. While India should take on concrete commitments and announce these, India's leadership in upholding climate justice and the development imperatives of developing countries is also a must. India will have to take a role of a norm leader and promote shared understanding around redefining just transitions, which at the moment is more mitigation centric, and climate justice. I would like to acknowledge all the authors who have contributed to the COP Charter of Action as well as reviewers, and their names you can see on the screen. Thank you so much, patience, and this presentation along with the abstract of the chapters and key messages will be available on TERI website. Thank you so much for your patience and attendance.
Thank you, Dr. Kedia. Over to you, Anurag.
Thank you. We now move on to the panel of the day titled Beyond Net Zero, what short and long-term strategies are needed for realizing the twin goals of climate stabilization and equity. I'm honored to invite Chair Ambassador Chandrasekhar Das Gupta, the Distinguished Fellow Emeritus, TERI. Ambassador Das Gupta has served as India's ambassador to China and to the European Union. Sir was involved in the UN climate change negotiations for over a decade during his foreign service career, following which he was appointed a member of the PM's Council on Climate Change. I request you, sir, to kindly introduce the panelists and to take over the proceedings of the session. Thank you. So please unmute yourself on mute.
Can you hear me now?
So we can hear you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to chair this very important discussion. Our panelists are really some of the most original thinkers on the subject in India, and I'm looking forward to listening to their views on the subject of Beyond Net Zero. Now, in his opening address, the Honorable Minister of Environment and Forests, Shri Bhupender Yadav, made a very important statement which should serve as the background of our discussions. And he stressed the point that equity and climate justice must be the touchstones by which we measure the success or otherwise of COP26 and future negotiations, future actions on climate change. Dr. Shirley Kedia, in presenting the TERI COP26 Charter of Actions, I think also made a very important point, which further develops this point, this question of equity, when she said that developed countries should move towards net negative by 2050 and not merely net zero. In fact, this raises a very important question, not only from the point of view of equity, but also national circumstances. Because obviously, from a purely practical point of view, equity considerations apart, there can be no magical year in which every country, whether it is one of the most technologically advanced and affluent countries in the world, or a low-income country with relatively poor technology infrastructure, that these countries achieve net zero in one single year, 2050. Is it realistic to think that if the most advanced economies, technologically advanced, affluent societies achieve net zero in a year, then every developing country must also achieve it the same year? Isn't there a normal time lag between countries which take the lead in implementing new technologies and others which follow suit as as economies of scale bring down the costs of these technologies? I hope these will be some of the questions which our distinguished speakers will address. Now, the list of speakers, the order in which I'll introduce them and call on them to take the floor is the following. Mr. Srinivas Gotru, when it is, if he's, as soon as he's available. Mr. Atul Bagai, Dr. Navroz Dubash, Dr. Archana Negi, Mr. Manish Chaurasia, and Mr. Chandra Bhushan. So shall we begin with Mr. Atul Bagai, the country head for India of UNEP, if Mr. Gotru will join us a little later.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thanks to TERI and other partners for inviting UNEP. And with such an august panel being chaired by an equally august and iconic ambassador, I wonder what little value I can add to these discussions. But I think the speakers before me have highlighted the issue very well. And as Shelley said, the science is clear, meaning there is no doubt and that we are putting so much of extreme pressure on our planet. And the evidence, as Vibhaji said, we see with our own eyes is also very clear. The damage that we are causing to our human health, to our peace and prosperity. As the Secretary General was talking about our world and our planet being hit by a triple planetary crisis of climate change, of nature and biodiversity loss, and pollution. And we see it all around us. It affects every aspect of our lives in every country of the world, whether these are heat waves or storms, food insecurity, dirty air and water bodies choked with the chemicals and plastic. They've actually become part of our life. And this is the challenge that we are facing today. But what I'm really speaking about today goes a little deeper than science and economics. It cuts to the heart of one of the greatest challenges of our time. And how can we simultaneously realize the goals of climate stabilization, and as the Honorable Minister put, equity, and find that elusive ideal of sustainable development. Actually, at a macro level, that is the big challenge each and every one of us is facing. Vibhaji certainly talked about how climate change is hitting us harder every year, and I will not go into that. But we need to really get our act together to get back on track for the 1.5 degrees centigrade goal, the net zero ambitions that need to be scaled up. The first key point I would like to make is actually recovering from this pandemic that has we all have seen over the last 18 to 20 months. And as recovering from this pandemic, how are we lifting people out of poverty, hunger, and ill health? It is crucial that all of us avoid the mistakes of the past. And that's the first real key point I would like to make. Certainly infrastructure that supports human development or well-being is badly needed. And I'm not denying that development should stop. But I think we just need to do it differently. And that's a very crucial aspect we need to see while we are tackling climate change. We need to do things differently than we have done in the past. And today we really have an unprecedented opportunity to do just that, to get it right, as they say. That's because most of the infrastructure that will exist in 2050 has still not been built. And it'll take trillions of dollars of investment per year to build most of it, and mostly in the developing countries. So how do we get it right this time? It's easy to say, let's get it right. And I think to begin with, developing countries must immediately shift their recovery spending away from the harmful investments that fuel the triple planetary crisis. The message is clearly not getting through because more than 80% of the 2.25 trillion in recovery spending is still going towards business as usual. This is, I think, a grave mistake. These investments will lock in greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, and biodiversity loss that is already underestimating our well-being. So we really need to invest in greener technologies, in greener investments, because business as usual investments don't make any economic sense any longer. And we have a number of examples in renewable energy, which we have been talking about. And we need to see how we move around from there. Shelley, of course, said she does not like nature-based solutions, but I think that's one of the very key elements that need to be looked at. She gave a very good example of forests, and while the forests need to be increased in terms of their coverage, I think there are many other nature-based solutions, or you can use any other word. And eco-DRR is certainly one of those very important areas which would bring in the adaptation and remove the emission gap that is there in the adaptation side. I think one of the things which we need to look at, and I was taken up by one of the discussions we were having in one of our WhatsApp group recently, where one of our seniors in the service, Amita Pandeyji, put a very lovely point. And I think that's where we need to emphasize, especially in India, in the coming years. He said, why is it that climate change is becoming a profession or a job of just diplomats or technocrats or domain experts, a lot of whom are present here? He said, we need to change the narrative. We need to move the narrative away from the multilateral dialogues that are going on. And I feel multilateral dialogues are critical for reaching an international agreement, whatever shape it forms. While that is a very critical approach we need to take. But what he was also suggesting was, and this is something that is what we should do in India, is how can we make this narrative a household narrative? How can we bring this narrative in the discourses we are having at the national level on economics, on society, on governance, on various other social indicator discussions that we are having? And I think that's a very important part that we need to do, of making it a movement that is movement that brings in each and every household in the country. Unless that gets done, we may not be able to reach whatever targets or ambitions that we are setting for ourselves. And I see this quite a lot in my travels to the state governments, to the states, to the villages, where I think the people who are getting affected by climate change need to also get involved in finding the solutions. And I think that narrative is very important to change, and hope post Glasgow, we can start working on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bagai, for that very interesting presentation. You made some very important points, particularly the need to avoid mistakes of the past. And you made the point that we have unprecedented opportunities at this stage to do just that, and that the key really lies in the sort of investment decisions we make, particularly in developing countries, how to opt for the greener technologies which have now become available to move away from business as usual practice. And the other point which I thought was particularly important was the need to widen the dialogue on climate from something which is the sort of reserved field of experts to make it a household narrative, as you put it. I think that was a very, very important point. And I wonder whether in order to do that, to make it a household narrative, it is important to shift the focus to a greater extent to adaptation than has been the focus so far. May I now call on the next speaker on my list, Dr. Navroz Dubash, to take the floor. Dr. Dubash is a professor at the Center for Policy Research, and he's coordinating lead author for the chapter on policies and institutions for the 6th assessment report of the IPCC. In the early 1990s, Dr. Dubash helped establish the Global Climate Action Network as its first international coordinator. Dr. Dubash?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dasgupta. Thank you, Dr. Dhawan and Dr. Kedia, all the other organizers, and I'm delighted to be part of this very august group, and I look forward to the conversation. Let me try and make a few sort of pointed comments, and I will try and be brief so we can get to the discussion. So as we approach COP26, you know, what is the state of climate governance? What is the state of the conversation? And I think what we see is that there is certainly heightened global appreciation of the costs of climate change, fueled in part by the very hard-hitting IPCC Working Group 1 report. There seems to be sort of a collective sense that we have climate change already upon us. There is also a growing sense that climate change and mitigation in particular may actually bring some opportunities. So that language of opportunity in terms of low carbon growth, I think there's a growing sense that is something that we should think about more seriously. And it's really driven by the declining price of renewable energy as compared to coal on average around the world. But there is also a sense that we can't be sanguine about this, that transition to a lower carbon future is not going to be automatic or easy. So it's kind of in the balance, certainly much further along than many of us would have predicted 5 years ago, but not over that hill, as it were. I think another point that is worth making is that global COPs and conversations notwithstanding, the locus of action is firmly in countries. That is, that countries will go as fast as their national politics around climate change allow them to go. And outstripping a national political consensus on where and how fast to move is going to be an enormous challenge. We see this tussle going on in the US right now with the infrastructure bill and so on and so forth, and President Biden scaling down his ambitions. So international climate politics can help. Maybe it can be an accelerator, maybe it can be a source of support, but really the home turf is the home turf, and that is national politics. These are sort of a few overarching kind of comments, which I think is worth keeping in mind when we talk about COP26. So we were given a few questions that I'd like to kind of turn to in a more focused way, and I'll come back to these larger contextual points. The first sort of concept that is worth thinking about a little bit more as we approach COP26, and Ms. Thomas was talking about Alok Sharma's sort of 4-point agenda, the COP precedent, and the first among them, if I believe I heard right, was really about driving towards a net zero world by 2050. Again, the IPCC 1.5 report was an important amplifier of that call. Now, the thing about net zero targets, and I've written about this, many others on this call have written about this, is that I think that their attraction is that they provide what seems to be a clear clarion call. We have to get to zero, not well below 2 in terms of temperature, but zero. And that means that ultimately we have to decarbonize completely or find ways of increasing sinks in various ways. So it has mobilized a lot of action. And I think what the most productive part of it is that it has mobilized subnational action from corporates, from communities. The college my daughter has just started attending has declared it will be the first net zero college in the US, for example, which is quite astonishing, actually. So things like that, I think, are quite productive. As a global driver and as a national driver, I think there are more complications involved. Both Shaili Kedia and Manjeev Puri have just written a piece in the Hindustan Times, which I quickly read before this, making a point that I agree with. I have also written something similar in the conversation a few months ago, that if we are going to, on average, come to net zero by 2050, that doesn't necessarily follow that all countries will come to net zero at the same time by 2050. And Ambassador Dasgupta, I think, made the same point in his opening comments. And I think that it's worth underscoring that point, that in a sense, a net zero conversation doesn't actually sidestep this long-standing conversation on burden sharing or opportunity sharing, depending on your frame of reference, of course. But the questions of the pie and carving it up and how we decide don't go away just because we come up with a net zero formulation. But there's a bigger problem that I see, which is that the net zero formulation risks becoming a fairly hollow construct. It risks becoming a pressure valve that allows country to say that they're doing something in the distant future, taking the pressure off doing something in the present. So I think that for countries that are willing to put net zero pledges on the table, we should also be asking, are you front loading those pledges? Or are you backloading them? If most of the action happens in the second half of the period from now to 2050, it is much less valuable than if it happens in the first half of the period. And of course, this question of if you can do it before 2050, it opens up space for others. I am an advocate of India doing more and doing it faster on climate mitigation. But I don't think that if India were to make a net zero pledge, say by 2070, we would apply the standard Indian rule of China plus 10 years, for example. If we said net zero by 2070, for example, Mr. Kerry would be happy, Mr. Sharma would be happy, everybody would be able to declare victory. The G20 countries would be, the apple would be in the basket. But frankly, it would make not a whit of difference to what India does today. And in that sense, it would be a pressure valve sort of action. I mean, let's remember, 2070 is as far in the future as 1970s in the past. Can we remember the world in 1970? What kind of technologies we were talking about? I mean, in what ways are we going to act today based on our views of a 2070 world? So I think 2070 can be part of the conversation. It helps subnational action to the extent it helps in politics, move politics in countries where they matter. And it seems to make a big difference in Europe, which is great. Then certainly it should be a part of national political conversations. It cannot become a unitary political conversation about how we do climate change, because different countries work in different ways, and then national politics are driven by different things. So what are India's national politics driven by? Because I do think India needs to do, for our own sake, We are a deeply vulnerable country. We need to be part of a virtuous cycle of driving other countries to do more, but also to do more ourselves. What can India do? So I believe we should update our NDC. I believe this sort of story about standing on kind of legalisms and saying, well, we don't really have to do it for another so many years. We should go ahead and do it. Our last NDC was fine, but as I wrote at the time, it was kind of a par NDC. It was something that we were going to achieve, and it looks like we will without considerably additional effort. And what should we have in that NDC? Well, one thing, we can certainly update our intensity target. But again, I don't see evidence that the intensity target drove anything in particular in the last few years, and I don't imagine it will again. It's just too big and too amorphous. I think the center of gravity of what our NDC should be is sector by sector plans, not so much targets, maybe targets in some cases, sector by sector plans to bring about development and climate co-benefit based changes in key sectors. We need to rapidly decarbonize our electricity sector. And I don't think we should just be talking about renewable energy capacity targets. We need to be talking about targets in terms of carbon per kilowatt hour. It's an outcome target. We need to be talking about transport and carbon per passenger mile traveled, while having development objectives like congestion of cities, air quality, and so on. We need to aggressively figure out sector by sector how to decarbonize in ways that bring development, and have outcome-based metrics to do that. And those outcome metrics are both carbon and development outcomes that we want. We need to, and this is something that Chandrabhushan's organization has been talking about, we need to much more aggressively think about a just transition in our coal sector to prepare the groundwork for that transition in ways that are not socially disruptive. So the core of it, I think, are these sectoral approaches. We will need a few high-profile announcements. I personally don't think we should keep ramping up these renewable energy capacity announcements, because at some point it starts distorting decision-making in the electricity sector. We should instead, as I say, have a carbon per unit per kilowatt hour kind of outcome-based metric. But I think the time may have come for us to actually announce that India won't build any more coal-fired power plants beyond what is already in the pipeline. All our coal-fired power plants are operating at very low plant load factors, and I know that we are seeing a resurgence of the coal conversation today. I don't think any private sector entity expects to make money on a new coal-fired power plant that they will break ground on today, despite all the recent issues. And I think it will send a clear kind of political signal that will actually be quite important, and I think a lot more meaningful than a net zero in the distant future sort of target. The last thing I think India should do is, and again, I'm aligned here with Chandrabhushan, his organization and mine have both been having this conversation. It's time for us to think about seriously ramping up the legal and institutional framework for climate change. We have a couple of briefs out on this. I think we have to think about a climate law, not one that regulates carbon, but one that facilitates the kind of mainstreaming of a low carbon future into development that I was talking about with reference to sectoral approaches. And we need an institutional structure that is up to the task. The Ministry of Environment and Forests and Climate Change is the nodal agency, but it doesn't have either the authorities or the expertise to actually play that coordinating role and foster an all of government approach or an all of society approach. We need to rethink our institutions. And I'm talking mostly about mitigation, but this is true in double measure for adaptation, because we also have to think about coordination across center and states. Ambassador Daskupta, do I have another minute, or am I out of time?
You have another minute.
I have another minute. Okay. The last thing I will say is that I think it's time for us, that's shifting back to the global level, it's time for us to think very hard about the forthcoming global stocktake and how we're going to take on this equity kind of story. We're in a world now where there's been a proliferation of, it's a cottage industry of people making calculations about fair shares and so on. It's been going on for a long time. It is going to come back with amplified force in the context of a global stocktake, because there will be many people trying to say this is fair, this is unfair, and by what metric. Many of us have urged the government of India to be very cautious about celebrating when India is given a good ranking by one of these metrics, because almost inevitably the next ranking is negative. And in fact, the Climate Action Tracker moved India from being, I think, one of the top rankers to being highly insufficient and below the US in, from one iteration to the next. And it's really, the problem is that these are composite metrics. In the case of the tracker, it happened because they included targets instead of just policies. They benchmarked against least cost pathways, which is again just silly from an equity point of view, and so on and so forth. The point I'm trying to make is that the devil really is in the details on these equity conversations. And in a world where renewable energy costs are now lower than coal, an emergent conversation says, actually, maybe the equitable thing to do is to accelerate your transition, because then you're breaking your cost of your energy system actually lower, which will have benefits to the poor. The point is that kind of argument, while it has a kernel of truth, ignores the fact that the key issue is not just the cost of energy, it is the transaction costs. How do you turn a very complex political, institutional, and social system like India's energy sector around, given that our electricity choices are tied to things like political issues like cross subsidies for railway? It's tied to investments by our public sector banks. It's tied to all the employees of the discoms and the generation plants. It's tied to the fact that state entities like controlling their own thermal power plants for whether or not it's cost effective. So these transaction costs and the need to actually manage this transition in a way that does not place the burden on the poorest, that's the reason for the equity conversation. That countries like India need some time and space to figure out how to make this transition. And we have less of a buffer because so many more of our population are right at the threshold of impoverishment or below that threshold. So I think that we need to reframe the equity conversation and saying, look, we all know we need to make this change. We all know that there are gains to be made, but don't tell us it's costless. This is a hard thing to bring about, and we need to figure out a way to move our systems in ways that make that happen. And for that reason, we need both a little bit of flexibility and we need finance, technology, etc., support of various sorts. So I think it's that kind of reframing of equity that I think we should be striving for in the stock tick. Let me stop there, Ambassador Dasgupta. Thanks for hearing me out patiently.
Thank you, Dr. Devash, for that fascinating survey, the intervention. You made so many important points, it's difficult to summarize all of them. But the ones which struck a particular chord where I'm concerned are the following. The first is the limitations of the net zero goal, that it's a goal for the distant future. And we do not know whether a country which commits itself to net zero is backloading or front-loading its sort of actions, unless there's a specific action plan which has been presented. The implications for India, as you said, is that it doesn't really make much difference if we declare a net zero 2070 goal by using simply a rule of thumb sort of procedure, because I haven't seen any serious study which justifies identification of any specific year for the declaration of net zero. The third important point which you made concerns our national politics, the need to update the NDC and to focus on sectoral plans which combine our development and climate objectives. And lastly, we pointed to the need for a legal and institutional framework. I look forward to further writings on your part as to what form this might take, because it's a very, very complex issue as far as I can make out. Now, may I call on the next speaker, Dr. Archana Negi, to make a presentation. She teaches at the School of International Studies, Nehru University, and her focus is on international trade and environment. Dr. Negi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I've been having some connectivity issues, so I don't know whether it's my connection or I'm just losing the conversation in between a little bit, but I still hope to be able to put my views across. So I hope I'm audible to everyone. So first of all, okay, thanks. First of all, thanks to TERI for having me, and congratulations for the initiative to prepare this, Charter of Actions for COP26.
Yes, I should do that.
I think this is much needed. Also, big hello to everyone who's attending and also to my co-panelists. As the ambassador just said, I teach a course on international environmental negotiations. And I assure my co-panelists that, all of you are on my reading lists. So you do have students reading and following up your very important work on climate change negotiations. And we are collectively all very familiar with what all of you do. So the panel session is on, beyond net zero. And of course, the most crucial question of realizing the twin goals of, how to stabilize the climate and at the same time look at aspects of equity. Now, addressing these twin goals is of course not an easy task, precisely because of the often contradictory directions in which these goals work. So to contextualize where we are at the moment, the International Energy Agency tells us that there are two sorts of statistics that are growing. So on the one hand, even while you have the number of countries pledging to achieve net zero emissions growing, these pledges, the IEA tells us, even if fully achieved, will fall well short of what is required to get to net zero. That is bringing the global energy-related carbon dioxide emissions to net zero by 2050. This means we are already en route to violating Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, which mandates a sort of global response to climate change that will ensure that global average temperatures will remain well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, and even to pursue efforts to limit this increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So this is just to sort of contextualize what we are speaking about here. Now, clearly COP26 is very, very critical. And speaking at UNESCO Paris yesterday, the president-designate Alok Sharma threw out the catch line where he said, Paris promised, Glasgow must deliver. Very nice line to hear, very difficult to actually get work moving in this direction. The focus of the UK's work as the president, as holding the presidency of the Glasgow conference, and this is something which Shelley had also already circulated, includes roughly the focus on the net zero emissions target, mitigation related, then step up action on adaptation and resilience, which is the adaptation related action. Third, the finance, the big question about delivering the 100 billion climate finance commitment. Talking about private finance as well, but also importantly, increasing collaboration on all of these objectives. Now, what all preparations towards COP26 and also all of the reports that have come from outside have been telling us that any chance of meeting the 1.5 target of the Paris Agreement is contingent upon global emissions halving by 2030 and then reaching a net zero by 2050. So by the time we get to Glasgow, which is very soon around the corner, the systems that have been put in place in Paris need to be tested. I mean, one question would be, is the ratchet mechanism working? I mean, other than the fact that there are different timelines, etc. So a key indicator of the success at Glasgow will be if many parties to the Paris Agreement submit new NDCs, which are collectively then ambitious enough to make it to the 1.5 degree target. Another sort of thing that we are looking forward to or will be keenly watching would be the requirement, one of the requirements for a successful outcome at Glasgow would be whether the developed countries would honor the promise of mobilizing 100 billion per year to support climate action in developing countries in particular. And equally important will be the strengthening of the ability to adapt to the climate impacts. So the UK is broadly calling, and this is what Boris Johnson has talked about also in his speeches, but Alok Sharma as well, to make big commitments in 4 areas, and there are specific ones which I won't go into. This is mainly in response to the questions that were sent to me, so I'm starting with this sort of overview on COP26. And the 4 big commitments in the area of coal, cars, cash, and trees. That's how they put it in their one-word sort of bullet points. So the broader call is for committing to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And as far as the developments related to that are concerned, and this is updated as of September 2021, so there may be minor changes to this. You have 86 countries and the EU 27 that have already submitted new or updated NDCs to the UNFCCC. Secretariat, you have China and Japan already pledging new 2030 targets, but they are yet to officially submit these. The UK has pledged to reduce emissions by 68% by 2030 and 78% by 2035. EU at 55% target by 2030, US 52% by 2005. Several countries like Australia, Brazil, Mexico, etc., have submitted without raising ambition. So India does not fall within that category. So there is still this ambiguity of what is going to happen by the time COP26 takes place. India is one of the 70 countries which are yet to communicate new or updated targets. And as has been said by the speakers before, whether this will be a changed NDC is something which is still out there. Clearly, a lot of focus is being put on this, renewed sort of focus on newer NDCs that countries are being asked to provide before the COP26 or at the COP26 at Glasgow. So this is just a very broad summary of what delegates and the world at large are looking forward to at or will be watching keenly at the COP26. Now, let me just tweak this, the section title a little bit to say, it says beyond net zero, but of course, everything that was said by the speaker before me already has, and I agree with all of what India needs to do as far as the COP26 track is concerned. But let me also take this a little bit forward. And one of the key points that I wanted to submit is to take it beyond COP26. So the argument that I'm making here, or the submission that I'm making, is that what happens or the outcomes that India will face at Glasgow at COP26 will result from a whole lot of pressure points that actually sit outside of the conference track. And if all of you, just revert and go back to the climate negotiations, and especially the deadlocked years before the Paris Agreement, we all remember that a large part of the climate negotiations, the energy that was expended was just to keep climate negotiations on track at the UNFCCC and not allowing the climate agenda to sort of escape into other fora. One of the things that is important to watch out for as far as India's climate diplomacy is concerned, that of course it is connected to outcomes relating to climate and the fact that India is slated to be one of the worst among the countries that will suffer the most from the impacts of climate change. There is also the second sort of driver, which is the development aspirations that India has and has been talking about. But the third point that I also want to bring in is the strategic concerns that will drive whatever India does at COP26. And the strategic concerns will derive from a lot of action that is happening outside of the COP track. So let me just very quickly bullet point and point out what I mean by these. So in yesterday's sort of speech that Alok Sharma made, the president designate of COP26, he talked about the updating of the 2030 ambitions, but he specifically focused on the G20. Now, this, I think, is going to be one of the core pressure points that India is going to face as a negotiator at the COP20. In his words, and I'm quoting from his speech yesterday, he said, the response, quote, the response of the G20 will quite simply be make or break for keeping 1.5 within reach, unquote. And then he went on to describe and say that at the G20 climate energy ministers meeting in July, every G20 country agreed to set out ambitious 2030 emission reduction targets before COP26. But he did not stop there. There was actually a roll call where he named individually all of the countries that had sort of done their homework as expected, and the defaulting students as well. Right, so he says the UK, France, Italy, Germany, EU, Canada, US, Argentina, Japan, South Korea, and South Africa have done so. Now the rest must deliver. All eyes will be on the G20 leaders meeting at the end of this month. So 11 of the G20 countries were extended this sort of pat on the back. Who were the defaulters? Well, India was one of them. So the remaining 9, Australia, Brazil, etc., but India as well. So my point is that we've had these kind of pressures before. If you just look back at the National Action Plan on Climate Change, and if you look at the international events that were happening in and around the time, you had the Heiligen Dam process just a few months before in 2007, and you had the pressure that the G8 had, the then G8 had reached out to the so-called outreach countries. You had the pressure of the fact that China had already come out with its own national action plan, and therefore, going to the next G8 meeting without a national action plan on climate change would be some kind of a pressure, that India will have to deal with. So I think, through the G20, this whole narrative of pressurizing the remaining of the G20 on whom the world's eyes are fixed, etc., is certainly going to be one of the pressure points and one of the more important ones. There are several others, of course, and some of the recent developments tell you about the various sort of different coalitions from within which India has been also making statements relating to its climate ambitions, etc. So let me just refer to, for example, the BRICS New Delhi Statement on Environment, which was adopted in August this year. Another pressure point for India also comes from the very high-profile membership that it has in this, high-profile new grouping of the Quad, which met for the first time in person, and there was a joint statement. Again, which expressed the common intention of all Quad countries to update, their NDCs before the COP26, and a sort of lauding of those members who had done so. Japan and US have already done so, and Australia and India then, have to sort of live up to whatever that statement has meant. There are also other fora like, the UN General Assembly, where Prime Minister Modi spoke about, climate ambitions, and especially raising the sort of energy-related targets that India has. And also not to forget that the UN Security Council, in which India is currently sitting as a non-permanent member, is also debating issues of climate change, including as recently as this February and September as well. So this is new. And there are things that are happening there which are new and which could then, lead to the sort of pressure that India as a negotiator may have to deal with in the sense of how it responds. So that's the sort of general first point that I wanted to make. Shelley, I'll keep some of the questions that you had sent maybe for the discussion period. That but one or two that I wanted to very quickly sort of address. One was specifically on India being a normative leader in the context of taking forward ideas of climate justice and sustainable lifestyles. I think this is very important, and in asserting sort of India's leadership role in climate negotiations in particular, its normative role has often been invoked. And Ambassador Dasgupta has written also about the early days of the negotiations of the UNFCCC, where you had the principles of equity and per capita emissions, etc., being put forward, the linking clause, etc., being put forward by India. And the role that it has played as far as the norms are concerned. Now, climate justice, just two things. One, I wanted to point out the interesting formulation that there is in the Paris Agreement. So when you look at the preamble and look at the provision on climate justice, it's formulated in a very interesting way. It says, noting the importance of ensuring the integrity of all ecosystems recognized by some cultures as Mother Earth, and noting the importance for some of the concept of climate justice. So it's a sort of hesitant acceptance of this norm, which is still in a nascent, stage of formulation, etc. So if a normative leadership role is something that India is looking for at Glasgow and beyond, then just two very quick points that I think should be kept in mind. First, that the principles that all...
We're running out of time. Can we?
Oh, okay.
Please, and then.
Okay. I'll just stop.
Return.
Okay, I'll just stop with this point. Just wrapping up the climate justice point, which is that the issues that are already there, or principles of equity, per capita carbon space, historical responsibility, etc. These have already been a part of the negotiations. And defining climate justice then as distinct from and additional to these principles is what will add value to the concept. That is, what more does it bring to the table? And second and last is that the acceptance of normative leadership at the international level will stem from a uniformity in application of the idea at the domestic level. This is important, for instance, that India not use the per capita emission idea to hide behind at the international negotiations, its per capita argument, while turning a blind eye to the problems of economic disparity and unsustainable lifestyles within, etc. So I'll stop with these 2 points, and I'm sorry if I've exceeded the time, and hand over the floor back to Ambassador Dasgupta. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Negi, for that wide-ranging intervention. You drew attention to the dynamics of international negotiations, not only on the UNFCCC forum, but also on other multilateral fora. And I think this helps to place the issue in its broader context. So thank you very much for that. And we'll return perhaps in subsequent discussion on some of the very important issues you touched upon, including the way in which the concept of climate justice was diluted in the Paris Agreement compared to the original Framework Convention on Climate Change or the Kyoto Protocol. May I now invite Mr. Srinivas Bothru, Joint Secretary dealing with UN Economic and Social Concerns Affairs in the Ministry of External Affairs. Mr. Gothru, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, and I'm sorry I'm joining the discussion a little late. I'd like to thank TERI for organizing the event and inviting me here. Also, thanks to Ambassador Dasgupta and Ambassador Puri. It's a pleasure to see you both in this discussion. I'll just put across a few points briefly from, I think, more from the international negotiations point of view. As we in the lead up to COP26, I mean, throughout this year, we've been seeing several of these issues which are extraneous to the COP discussion itself, also kind of, come into the discourse. And we see a lot of, there's a big push and growing calls for some of these to be adopted, one of which is net zero, as I'm sure all the panelists are well informed on this. Also about updating of NDCs, but then there are other issues on which there's no consensus yet, which is the global methane pledge, for instance, phasing out of coal. Some of these other issues which are currently not on the table for COP have also started creeping in. I think briefly, I think that the topic is, of course, very timely and important, and I congratulate TERI on organizing this. I just want to, I'll restrict my thoughts to, I think, some of the things about net zero. And now there is, according to the UN Secretary General's website, there are more than 130 countries which have sort of spoken about net zero. Not all of them seem to have pledged it, but there is, of course, there's a difference of view on how many countries have actually put it in policy documents, how many are actually translating that into NDCs, and so on and so forth. But at this stage, I think there are important questions on the limitations of this concept, or viability of this concept in terms of how much of the actual science can support, say, for instance, land-based sinks, allowing this kind of absorption to take place, and given the limits of the ability of forests to trap CO2 emissions in perpetuity, and also the limits on the technology side, which is the carbon capture technologies, and how these can be scaled to be economically viable, or to the scale where you can start making an impact on global level in terms of CO2 emissions. So those are some of those things, gaps in that understanding, where it's not entirely clear. But I think there are some assumptions which are made, which naturally, I think from my work point of view, there's certainly an interest that I would have in highlighting those gaps, and that is the kind of discourse that we would like to encourage, both in the think tank space and the civil society space, on how these assumptions in terms of CO2 absorption are being sort of co-opted into this overall scheme of net zero, and being projected as the solution. And also in the process of this are some of the principles that are fundamental to the framework on climate negotiations, which are the principles of equity and the common but differentiated responsibilities, which particularly for the developed world, the developing world, and by developing I mean not just the developing countries, but also the underdeveloped and the least developed countries. I think for them, it's a sort of a foundational principle on which these negotiations have been based over the years. And therefore, we see there has always been, I suppose, an attempt to kind of sideline this principle and focus on pick and choose the principles that you want to do. But this is something that India has resisted, and this is something which I think we should continue to resist. And there should be it's not just the voice of the government. I think there are strong voices in the civil society space, in the research institutions and think tanks, that are also echoing this sidelining of some of these foundational principles, and that needs to be highlighted, not just within India. Of course, I see a vibrant discussion within India, but also within the Western media, particular, I think tends to kind of sort of take a unidimensional view of this, and that narrative needs to be balanced. And therefore I would encourage TERI and everybody else participating here to look at this and putting the voice out in these channels as well, these fora, where it can sort of balance out the narrative. Then, of course, there is the question about available carbon space when we talk about net zero, and how much of remaining carbon space is available for the developing world or the non-developed world in that sense. And while those estimates vary depending on what kind of global warming scenario the IPCC is projecting, the fact remains that between US, EU countries, and China, the cumulative emissions have already crossed 50% of that space. So how much of it is left for everybody else is something that certainly concerns us in India, and indeed it should concern most of the world, because we are just talking about a group of about 28, 29 countries which are occupied that entire space. And if that carbon space is going to be vacated at all for the other countries to enable other countries to grow, that's the other part of this net zero argument, which hasn't been highlighted enough in the discourse, I feel. And that is something that while we are interested in seeing how much of that carbon space is going to be vacated, that needs a clearer articulation on part of the developed countries, I think. There is, of course, as I said, the looking at it entirely from this targets which have been put like 2050 or whatever on in terms of achieving net zero is sometimes tends to get unidimensional. And I think Paris Agreement, despite it does its critics about how it's compromised some of the foundational principles, does sort of seek to kind of find a balance between the finance aspects and the technology aspects, which again haven't really come across very clearly on what are the enhanced commitments that countries can make in terms of finance or in terms of technology. The 100 billion target, which is yet to be reached, has now been it's now been crossed many times over. So the cost of this just transition or green transitions that we are talking about is many times it's running into trillions of dollars. So the cost of whatever scenarios that we are projecting is something that again needs to be highlighted in the international discourse, and that we'll have to find a way of putting that squarely back on the table to evolve a balanced outcome in COP. I think those are the two other aspects which need to be. I mean, it's not just in COP, but I know kind of restoring that balance in COP and beyond. I think to bring it back that sort of importance of finance and technology. We've also been talking about sustainable lifestyles, and Prime Minister himself has mentioned this on how can how Indian ethos kind of supports harmony with nature and how we should be encouraging sustainable lifestyles and consumption. India's electricity consumption is probably less than 50% of what is consumed worldwide, and our emissions are also 60% less. And given that sort of a framework with an aspirational middle class, how much of this limitations can you impose is the fundamental question, and the cost of imposing something like this, that is really where India comes from. And I think a large part of the developing world also is looking at that, and that would be our expectation on how to rebalance this entire discourse. I will stop here. I think basically just to kind of give my sort of take on these aspects. But thank you again very much for inviting me to participate in this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gothru, for drawing our attention to an extremely important dimension of the current international discourse on COP26 and the forthcoming negotiation. The unfair pressures which are being brought to bear on India and many other developing countries in regard to a 2050 net zero target, updating NDCs to make them even more ambitious than they were, and phasing out coal in the future, to drew attention to the need for an equitable sharing of carbon space, for a just transition to cleaner technologies, the importance of financial and technological support, which has been totally inadequate so far, and the importance of sustainable lifestyle is a point which India has been trying to hammer home for a considerable time. Thank you very much for these inputs, which I'm sure will guide further discussions in this and other fora. May I now invite our next speaker, Mr. Manish Chaurasia, to take the floor. Mr. Chaurasia is the Managing Director of Tata Cleantech Capital, which is the first private sector green investment bank in emerging markets, jointly promoted by Tata Capital and the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. Mr. Chaurasia.
Thanks, Ambassador. I hope I'm audible to everyone. Okay. So thanks a lot, Ambassador, once again. And thanks a lot, TERI, for giving Tata Cleantech Capital this opportunity. And many congratulations on the Charter of Actions. They are quite timely. Good afternoon to all the participants. So as we know, the politics around climate change is highly complex. because of the fact that if you see the cumulative emissions, and if you also see the per capita emissions, most of it is from the developed world, from just 2-3 countries. But unfortunately, going forward, while the developing countries on a per capita basis will contribute a very small chunk to the emissions, but on an aggregate basis, they'll have to play a very important role because that is where the emissions are likely to be very high. If they follow the same pattern of growth which has happened in the past, which was carbon intensive. Naturally, politics is complex. But I think it is extremely important to remember, and which we all know, is that climate change is a global problem and it requires a global cooperation. So in this context, I think it is important to remember that technology and finance and policy are 3 important pillars in fighting this climate change. And as far as finance and technology is concerned, developing countries will need a significant support from the developed world. When it comes to finance, a lot is made about the fact that a huge amount of money is required to actually fight the climate change. But if you see the statistics, on an average, the global savings have been around $20 trillion per annum. But what we require to fight climate change is, there are various estimates and they all vary. But it is about $3 to $4 trillion per annum. So this is just about, say, 15 to 20% of the global savings. So actually, that amount is not very high because, this problem is threatening our existence. The key challenge is that most of the savings are in the developed countries, while the requirement is in the developing countries. So clearly, the very fundamental to fighting climate change is this movement of savings from the developed world to the developing world. And as has been said earlier, while 100 billion per annum was promised in the Paris Accord, but actually not even a small trickle of that has happened. So I think this is one area where a lot of global thought needs to go. And we need to find solution to this. So that is my point number 1. The point number 2 is that while countries have pledged, net zero, and in fact now, in this forum we also spoke about negative emissions by 2050. But the fact is that we have used more than 90% of the carbon budget, and even if, say, in 2-3 years we go to zero carbon, even then, a lot of warming has already been locked in the atmosphere. And which basically means that we are going to see a lot of water scarcity. We are going to see a lot of coastal cities getting submerged. And that is going to happen throughout the world. So clearly here, we are not talking about just an environmental problem. We are also talking about a huge social problem, which will lead to large-scale migration. So the point I'm trying to make is that adaptation has to be thought very, very carefully and very deeply. Till now, a lot of talks have happened in terms of adaptation, but actually very less capital has been earmarked. So in my view, a lot of thinking needs to go into adaptation once again, globally. The third point I want to make is that while we talk about the fact that we have to go to net zero, but then the way we transition is also important. Just in the last few days, we have seen that there was a huge coal shortage, because of which the cost of power went up. And there's a lot of crisis, in fact, in a few countries. Now, if the transition doesn't happen smoothly, and if there's a coal shortage, then naturally cost of power will go up, and the developing countries will not be able to face it. And actually, it is not just about coal. If you take the mining of other minerals, like say aluminium and copper, they are the basic raw material when it comes to putting up a renewable power plant. You need a lot of copper, you need a lot of aluminium, you need a lot of silver. And even if you take electrical vehicles, where the technology is fairly established, it actually takes far more copper than the internal combustion engine vehicle takes. So if suddenly the mining of these minerals is stopped, or if it happens abruptly, then the cost of these inputs will go up, which will lead to cost of increase in renewable energy. So it is extremely important to do a smooth transition, and a lot of thinking needs to go into this globally. So these are the 3 points I want to make when it comes to equity and climate justice. One is clearly that a lot has been made about finance, but actually problem is very small, and it can be easily addressed if there is a will. The second is that a lot of thinking needs to go into adaptation. And lastly, the smooth transition is extremely important to ensure that there is acceptability of this transition in all the countries. And it does not just remain a topic which all the academics and all the experts speak about, as was also told earlier. The other point which I want to touch about is what we need to do by 2030, especially in India, and what we need to do beyond 2030 up to 2050. And what I say definitely applies to India, but I think this applies to probably not many other countries. So first thing I would like to highlight based on my experiences, a relatively simple thing, which is about the enforcement of contracts. And this has got nothing to do with the financing needs. In India, we have seen that the renewable energy, like in the other parts of the world, are highly capital intensive. And if someone is putting a plant, then he needs a return which comes over 10 to 25 years. And naturally, you need some kind of a surety that the power will be sold. And in our country, when all the power is actually distributed by the government, state government agencies, we need a firm contract whereby this power can be sold at a firm cost for 15 to 25 years. Unfortunately, in our country, while the power purchase agreements are being signed, but there have been a lot of renegement of contracts in some states. If this happens, then this whole story will go fat. So that is my point number one. The point number two is that the fund requirement in India itself, as per our estimate, is about 1.6 trillion US dollars by 2030. And if you see our banking system, this is 60% of our whole banking system. Now, if that kind of funds is required, obviously government cannot do it alone. It requires a public-private partnership. Now, today what is happening is that private sector is putting up the capacities and the off-takers are government agencies. So it is very important for us to strengthen these public institutions because today they don't have money to pay to the developers. And this is creating a huge problem. Today, some states are delaying payments for more than 12 months. The cycle is sometimes 18 months. Now, if the developers are not paid, then it is going to lead to huge problem. So that is my point number two. And this has got nothing to do with financing. If these two things are addressed, then a lot of private capital will come in automatically. The third is that today in India and in a lot of other parts of the world, while a lot of developments are happening in renewable energy because the technology has improved by leaps and bounds, but unfortunately, the manufacturing ecosystem is there in just a few countries. So today, actually, we are importing most of our panels, most of our inverters, and most of the other equipments which are required in renewable energy. And when it comes to electric vehicles, today we are importing all the batteries, all the DC motors. We need to have this manufacturing system within India. Only then our emissions will be scalable. I think these are three very important points. The other thing which we have noticed is that in the name of green financing and in the name of green investment, a lot of green washing is happening, whereby people are claiming that they are doing green investment, but actually they're not doing it. So it is important that we work on some kind of a taxonomy. And that taxonomy is used uniformly so that we are very clear what is green. And we just don't get carried away by what all the talks. Lastly, for us, we have to prepare today for beyond 2030. So today, while on renewable energy and light electrical vehicles, we are pretty much there in terms of technology. But that's not going to be enough. We also have to solve the problem of heavy duty transport. Say, the heavy duty trucks or say ships or say aeroplanes. So for us, it is very important to invest in green hydrogen, which is the next generation technology. It will not only help us to solve that problem, but it will also help us to kind of create some kind of a security. Because today, when it comes to batteries, we are fully dependent upon imports. So it is just that the fossil fuel imports will get replaced by the battery imports. So that preparation, I think, is extremely important. And lastly, today it is very important that we work on new technologies like carbon capture and storage. Because it's very clear that the way emissions are going up today, unfortunately, the fossil fuels are subsidized when we are talking about carbon tax. So if this is the situation, then emissions will not come to zero if we are realistic about it. So clearly, we will need to prepare for carbon capture and sequestration so that we can reduce the carbon from the atmosphere. It will be important for us and the other countries to prepare for it. So this is what I think we need to do urgently till 2030. And beyond 2030 up to 2050, I think the most important thing is that at some stage, all the countries will have to think about carbon tax. Today, instead of taxing carbon, many countries actually subsidize fossil fuels. So the market price is actually quite distorted. And I think this needs to be corrected, especially when we know that we have consumed more than 90% of our carbon budget. Lastly, I think beyond 2030, all the countries will have to go very aggressively towards green hydrogen and towards carbon capture and storage, so that we are able to keep the Earth within our climate change limits. So these were some of the points from me, and I'll be happy to take this discussions forward. Thanks, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chaurasia, for giving us a private sector and the real life perspective on the problems that confront us. You mentioned the need for paying greater attention to adaptation, and particularly the need for capital resources for adaptation programs. I mean, you made so many important points. I'm not going to list them. I'm just highlighting some points which seem to me to be important. The important point you made was the extent to which greenwashing is going, so-called green investments which are not green at all. Now, mention the carbon tax. Okay, carbon capture and storage. Now, perhaps later in the discussion, you would like to tell us something about the geology, whether we can ensure safe storage for decades, and whether geological structures in India allow this, and what are the areas in which this is possible. And finally, the carbon tax, which you saw as an initiative which we should be thinking of for the 2040 to 50 period. But is that not too late? Because if you're going to wait till 2040 for a carbon tax, the incidence will be more on developing countries whose historic emissions have been very low. Shouldn't we think of this at a much earlier stage? But these are just a few questions, and later, when, during the discussions, perhaps you will favor us with your comments on these or any others. Thank you very much once again. And now, a pleasure in calling Mr. Chandra Bhushan, the Chief Executive Officer of the International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology, I-FOREST, to make his presentation. Mr. Chandra Bhushan was conferred the Ozone Award by the UN Environment 2017 for his contributions to framing the Kigali Agreement to the Montreal Protocol. Mr. Chandra Bhushan.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and it is always a pleasure to be part of a program which you chair, and thank you very much. Thank you, TERI, as well, for inviting me. I'm really excited that you got a person from private sector in this panel, simply because what Manish did was to show the bare bone of what we are talking about. And it's always important to get private sector. And thank you, Manish, for basically telling us what is required on the ground. All these negotiations and policies and net zero, what it requires in the end is what you told. And I'm really excited that you are here in this panel, and made my job very easy. Let me start. One of the disadvantages of being the last speaker is that you want to respond to many things. I don't have that much time, but I will try and respond to some of the issues that have been raised by my co-panelists. First of all, every country picks and chooses what they want to push in international negotiation. It is not unique to the West. It is with us as well. Net zero is something we have signed on in the Paris Agreement. If India today thinks that net zero is some new construct, then we are wrong. Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement says net zero in as many words. So I find this discussion right now quite amusing that we are talking about beyond net zero right now without responding to what we have signed in the Paris Agreement. Of course, we have also signed CBDR and equity and sustainable consumption under the Paris Agreement. So this whole idea that, someone is picking and choosing and we are not is not correct. We too are picking and choosing. Net zero is something that I believe as a country, we should respond positively. And we should respond positively because we have so much strength to respond. I very strongly feel that by negating or by saying, you know what, this net zero is not going to work, or there are many problems in net zero, I think we are making our position even weaker. I say this simply because I don't think net zero has been fleshed out properly. And there is scope for India actually to define net zero depending on what are the realities of net zero. For example, under the Paris Agreement, if I have to define net zero, then there are 4 or 5 components that we need to very clearly bring out, which developed countries are not bringing out. For example, net zero has to be based on self-differentiation. Again, Article 4.1. Net zero has to be flexible because technology is changing. Today, what you say you will achieve net zero by 2050, maybe 5 years later, you can say, I will be achieving net zero by 2040. So net zero also has to be flexible, again, part of the Paris Agreement. Net zero has to be built on NDCs, again, part of the Paris Agreement. Net zero has to be built on finance and technology, again, part of the Paris Agreement. Now, instead of us saying that this is an artificial construct, that this is not going to work, I think there is enough option for us to define net zero in a way that is beneficial to us and beneficial for the world, and hold developed countries accountable. One of the advantages of net zero is that you can hold countries accountable, not only ourselves, but also developed countries. This is a number that everyone has to achieve. And if they have to achieve this based on, as Navroz says, whether you are front loading or you are back loading, everything will be clear. But at least a number on which you will be able to hold countries accountable. So my first point, Ambassador, is I think there is nothing called as beyond net zero. We haven't responded to net zero. And as a country, it is important that we respond in affirmation and positively to net zero. The second point I want to make is that in many sectors that we are looking at now, whether it is energy sector, transport sector, building sector, it doesn't make any sense for India to go back to old technologies. They are expensive. And therefore, it is in our interest, and many of the panelists have said that, and I want to reiterate it, that it is in our economic interest, and government is actually pushing all those policies. Just few weeks, I think few months back, we came out with a policy of incentivizing production-linked incentive for battery manufacturers. We have a very ambitious policy for electric vehicles. Renewable is already, we have an ambitious policy on that. Similar policies required in building sector and infrastructure sector. So I think that from economic perspective, it doesn't make any sense for us to talk about older technologies. And markets understand it. In fact, that's where I think Manish made it very clear. Whether government gets a policy which is supporting coal or not, private sector is not going to invest in coal. It is as clear as that, because it is long-term. It is a risk of a stranded asset that is linked to coal. You are going to have problem. So private sector is not going to invest in coal mine or coal-based power plant, or for that matter, private sector is not going to invest a lot on internal combustion engine as well. You are not going to see new IC engine factory in this country. Whatever production is going to happen, it is going to happen on the existing platform. So I think also net zero can be net positive for us. That is the point I'm trying to make. Net zero need not be net negative. Net zero need not be net zero. For us, both socially and economically, it can be net positive. In fact, some of the modeling study that I'm looking at it now, there is huge advantage for India to be net zero. Of course, there has to be a lot more fleshing of this issue. Multiple modeling will be required, but net zero, I believe, is net positive for this country. It is not net negative. And therefore, economically speaking, it makes sense for us to embrace net zero and define as we want. I don't think we need to define net zero as they want us to define. Again, a fundamental problem with us that we always respond instead of setting the stage, instead of setting the terms of reference, we keep responding to what developed countries want us to respond to, which I find quite at times disheartening. So again, economically speaking, net zero is net positive. The last point I want to make is that I think the time has come for all of us to define equity in the way it should be defined in 2020, not in the way it was defined in 1990. There is no carbon budget. It's as simple as that. There is not going to be excess carbon budget for us in the future if we think that 1.5 is a realistic goal. Of course, if someone thinks that 2.5 degrees is fine, then of course there is carbon budget. But if 1.5 C is the goal that we want to keep as a country, then there is no carbon budget. No one is going to vacate budget for us. Whatever countries do today, even if developed countries reach net zero by 2030 and China by 2050 or 2040, the carbon budget is over. So no one is vacating carbon budget for us. I think that's also something that we should be realistic about. Instead of fighting over carbon budget, we have to make carbon budget history. Let me repeat again. Instead of fighting over carbon budget, which does not exist and which is not there, we have to work together so that there is no discussion on carbon budget. And therefore, you will need a very different framing of equity than what we are framing right now. Current framing of equity is between you and me, us and them. I think that framing is not beneficial to them or to us. So I also think that the 1990 framing of equity is not a valid framework that is today for us in 2020 or going ahead. India needs resources, finance. India needs technology. India needs capacity. We are working on just transition, and just transition is nothing else but a new development agenda in coal mining part of the country. We virtually will have to build new economy, new cities, new businesses in coal mining part of this country. And it's a new development agenda for all of us. And we will require internal resources as well as external help in achieving that. So it makes immense sense for us to define equity in a way that it leads to a cooperative framework rather than a fight that is happening at UNFCCC. The last point that I would like to make, and I'll end here, is that I think India should submit its NDC now. Enough of this, drama whether we should submit our NDC or not. There is a huge gap between our old NDC and what we are already doing right now. In fact, if we add up what we are doing right now within the country, we can easily double our NDC right now, whether in terms of our EV policy, in terms of renewable energy, in terms of forestry, adaptation, building. If we put everything together, what different parts of the government and different states are doing, we already will double our NDC. So it makes sense for us to submit our NDC, go to COP26 as a leader who is going to set the stage rather than someone who is responding and is at the back foot all the time. I don't think that's what India should be at COP26. India should be a leader. Go with confidence. Do not use excuses. Be someone who is leading the world rather than following developed countries' diktat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chandrabhushan, for bringing some new perspectives on this issue. Because what we heard was distinctly new line, and it's extremely stimulating. And it makes possible very sort of interesting discussion or debate that we can have. Now, let me pick out a few points that I thought you made, which were particularly interesting. The first one was about the net zero concept. You said that this follows from Article 4.3 of the Paris Agreement, and we should welcome this. We should embrace this idea instead of opposing it. The second point, which I thought was very interesting, was that defining equity and the sharing of carbon space should look at the situation prevailing in 2020 and see what is the remaining carbon space and how that can be allocated fairly, rather than going back to the situation that prevailed in 1990 when we began the negotiations on the climate thing. And the third point which you made was that we are in a position to submit a revised and more ambitious NDCs, and that we should do so. Our targets for 2030 need to be updated. They're very, very interesting points, and thank you for this contribution. Now, I think we have another 20 minutes, and so I'm going to try and throw up what I feel were some points on which panelists held somewhat contrasting views, and perhaps you could sort of arrive at greater clarity on these. So let me first take up this question about net zero by 2050 target. Mr. Chandrabhushan made a very strong case for saying that we should endorse this, that it follows from point 3 of the Paris Agreement. We had earlier speakers who questioned this net zero sort of drive. India should give any target date at all. Now, I wonder if we have common ground, if we can find common ground in the following sort of proposition, that we endorse the global target of achieving net zero by 2050 as a global target. But that does not mean that every individual country achieves it on the same day. In fact, some of the presentations made during today's discussions make it clear that if the most advanced countries were to achieve 2050 as late, were to achieve net zero as late as 2050, then actually the global target could never be achieved, because inevitably there will be a gap between the date on which new cleaner technologies are adopted in advanced countries, technologically advanced, financially affluent, and countries which are poorer and less technologically advanced. So if we think that technology will take a certain transmission time to move from the most developed to those who are not so developed, then you cannot have a single date. In other words, we endorse the global target date of 2050. But question whether a global target date could be achieved if the most advanced countries were to postpone their own national target dates to 2050. This is a question which I'd like to throw open to panelists and for their views. Would anybody like to comment on that? Sorry.
Okay. Let me take a shot. See, one, that it is Article 4.1, Ambassador. It's for Article not 4.3. It's Article 4.1. But why do we believe that developed countries will get advanced technology first? I have a problem with that construct itself. Why is it, one of the debate on technology always is that developing countries need technology. And one of the small research I did was on solar PV IPR. Who holds the IPR for one kind of solar PV? And you will be surprised to know that there is no one IPR. There are a bundle of intellectual property rights for that one product. And for that one product, there were 116 individual intellectual property rights, out of which 60s were in developing countries, out of 116. So one of the ideas I think that we have that technology is emerging in developed countries and it will be adopted in developed countries first. I think we are missing the point right now in a world of collective learning, where technologies are also emerging in developing part of the world, including India. In fact, 7 or 8 IPR in that bundle was from India, including one of making steel struts for holding the panel, okay? Including one from Borosil for making the glass. So I'm just trying to tell you that this construct that we have, that developed countries will use the technology first and then it will come to developing countries, again is a construct of 1990s. It's not a construct which is valid today.
Not use the term developed or developing countries. I said technologically advanced countries. And while minor patents or modifications can indeed be made in countries like India, the solar cooker, for example, when it comes to transformational change, has it not historically been the case that technologically most advanced countries and countries which have the capital resources to meet the initial high R&D costs are the first to come out with breakthrough technologies, and then with scales of, with large-scale productions, scale economies kick in, prices of technologies come down, and developing countries follow, poorer countries follow suit. Has that not been the general pattern? I'm not talking about the. It's time to be educated because you have studied this in much greater detail than I have.
Yeah, Navroz, go ahead.
Else would like to take the floor? Navroz, yes.
Yeah, but if CB, if you want to answer that specific question, of course, please go ahead.
I just want to say that today, whereas the scale is concerned, China outcompetes everyone on any new technology that you see, whether it is battery or solar panel, anything, including the inverters, which you require on production. So as far as scale is concerned, China is far, far ahead of US or any European country. As I said, that going ahead in future, in next 20 to 30 years, I'll just take 1 minute to explain. I was traveling in Dhanbad a few days back, and you will be surprised to know that all the chai walas in Dhanbad had induction stove. All the chai walas had a solar panel and an induction stove. Okay. So the most advanced technology was adopted by the poorest of this country. And I am very excited with this. And this is what is going to happen. the poor will adopt the most advanced technology much quicker than the rich because it is an advantage of the poor. That is the point I'm trying to make. Navroz, please.
Yeah, so it's a perfect jump off point for me. I think this is why there's a lot I agree with in what Chandrabhushan is saying. And that is why, like him, I think we have to reframe the climate equity story, because advantages for the poor, it's no longer a story where advantages of the poor are tied to having access to coal. That version is just gone. We need a more nuanced version. Which is why this whole sort of allocation of the carbon space and so on and so forth, I think is very passé, because as I keep saying, and I said, earlier as well, if India won that battle, and we actually suppose, back in the day, Ambassador Asgupta, the basic countries put out their proposals, and India had a proposal, we should get so much of the carbon space. Suppose we got it, and suppose we used all that carbon space, we would be a technologically backward society by 2040. We don't want to be using all of that space, actually, right? So
it doesn't mean that we
I know, but beyond a point, fighting incredibly strenuously for the right to something that you don't particularly want to use at some point becomes self-defeating. I mean, how much are you going to leave on the table to argue for something that you don't really want to use in toto? So I think it's a more nuanced ask that we need. But let me bring this back to net zero. My issue with net zero is not that India is going to be taken to the mat and and so on and so forth. My issue is that we are collectively fooling ourselves if we think that setting net zero targets will automatically translate back to shifting of national politics. That's why I started by saying the game is about national politics. And you can tell a story about how in some countries, net zero will lead to accelerated action. In the UK, the Climate Change Committee said, here's what we have to do for net zero. Natalie Tom said that they also have a 2030 target that's associated with that. So they try and front load it. It works quite well. In Norway, something similar. In other countries, it will just be a pressure valve. And I think in India, it will be a pressure valve. Because I think that our interests lie, as Chandrabhushan is describing, in finding as many creative ways as possible to harness the gains of ever cheaper renewable energy for the poorest. We need to force our system to go as fast as possible. I just don't think net zero will do that. And so my problem with it is as the only or even the dominating conversation. I don't think it should be the dominating conversation. As a part of the conversation, sure. And I think, as I said, in India, the game is going to be these sectoral conversations. So, for example, we need to have a conversation about cooking fuel, the cooking transition in India, right? Should we be going down the road of gas, or should we be trying to leapfrog to electric-based induction? Right? I mean, I think we can make a case that even though gas may be carbon positive because it has air pollution gains and so on and so forth, we should be well within our rights to use it. So we want to, if we burn more carbon, we should be using it for things like that, things that give women in particular release from drudgery and more time and so on and so forth. And if the numbers work out that gas is the best thing to do in the short run, we should do it, climate or no climate. But if there's a way to actually get international cooperation and leapfrog to induction, then we should do that. Right? So these are the kinds of conversations we can have if we talk about it at a sectoral level, which is why I think this is the way in which we should be having this conversation. But I mean, just to put the agreement on the table, I think I dislike net zero not because so I read Chandrabhushan's proposal more as a tactical one. Why put India's head above the parapet? But I think that's a bit disingenuous because, then India will simply play the game. There are many people actually who are saying it won't hurt us to say 2070. Let's just say it and then get everybody off our back. But if you actually want to force these transitions in India, you want to use this moment to build pressure for productive conversations as opposed to a pressure release.
Sir, I would like to make a point.
I think, the chair's job not to express or to push his or her own opinion, but rather to bring out the implications of what panelists are saying in greater detail, with greater clarity. And these two interventions have been very helpful in that. Is there any other?
I want to make a point.
Take the floor.
Yeah, I would like to make a point.
Yes.
Manish Chaurasia.
Yes, Mr. Chaurasia.
Yeah. So the view what I want to give is that being aggressive on net zero can actually be a huge opportunity because now one of the way to grow the economy would be, I think, through investments in climate-related technologies. For the simple reason that if you see the technology in the last 10 years, the way it has improved, especially in solar and also in energy efficiency, clearly it has improved by multiple times. Now, the advantage of being aggressive would be that you'll be able to crowd in a lot of capital, which India needs. And secondly, technology will ensure that actually these, this way of progress is much better in terms of economies. Because, today, if you take coal, clearly it is expensive when it comes to generation. But if you take generation plus storage, probably we are still not there. But if we are little aggressive on generation plus storage, we can reach a point of disruption where that will be more economical compared to coal, and that will lead to a lot of investments, which will lead to our GDP growth. So I think we should see this as an opportunity to grow our GDP by crowding in international capital, and actually be quite aggressive on net zero. That's a view which I've got. And other point which I would like to clarify is that when I spoke about carbon tax, actually, I had said after 2030 for the simple reason that today, globally, we have actually got carbon subsidies. So it will be quite unrealistic to think that from subsidies we'll directly go to taxes. Probably we'll need to build a consensus globally that at least subsidies have to go first, and then probably go for a carbon tax. But of course, this is all very debatable. But I just thought I'll clarify that point.
Thank you very much. That is very interesting. Is there any other panelists who would like to speak on this question? I hear no other sort of panelists. We still have, I think, 7 minutes left by my watch. So let me raise another question, which I think...
Ambassador Dasgupta, I think Archana Negi had raised her hand.
Sorry, who?
Archana Negi, Professor Negi.
Please. Dr. Negi, would you take the floor?
Am I unmuted now? Yes. Sorry, I was going by the electronic hand, but it's very tiny on this platform, as I see. So I don't think it works as well. So I just wanted to come in, and say that, I mean, I overall agree that, this whole semantics of net zero, in fact, is not very new, because even, I would say, even going back before Paris Agreement, if you go back to Kyoto and the UNFCCC, ultimately what you were talking about were net emissions. So the equation was the same, how much you put out there and how much you can take back in. So it's just a new fancy way of packaging it. And I think the push is to put some sort of a dateline on it, to make domestic level changes and policy action then happen, etc. But in terms of usage, I just felt that I wasn't very sure with what you said, Chandrabhushan, about it can be net positive for India, because I'm not sure if you're using the word as a normative good, that this can be a positive thing for India, because one was treating it only as a technical sort of label, where you say that if the equation works out that your output is the same as what you're taking back in, that is carbon, net zero, etc. And net positive would, it in fact, mean something different in the mathematics of carbon emissions, etc. So I just wanted a clarification on that. Also appreciate a lot of other things which were said, but I think one didn't get enough time to get to those issues. But I really wanted to also bring back something which was also said in other presentations, the balancing of the requirements. And this was one of the questions also that had been circulated, of the requirements between mitigation and adaptation. I think that is something we need to be working on. And in international politics and international diplomacy in particular, I mean, one thing that works for adaptation is that the free rider problem that you find in mitigation aspects are not as applicable to those relating to adaptation. So adaptation is something countries have to do. They can't sit back and say, oh, well, if somebody else is fixing the climate problem, then I'm going to get a free ride on that. So adaptation, both in terms of balancing the financing part, and also because international law works on very soft mechanisms. There aren't jails and police for violations. Therefore, even the aspects of national communications, I feel, need to be strengthened legally at that level. If you look at the language of the Paris Agreement, it is still using the hortatory sort of should for the national communications, both for mitigation and adaptation. So that is, again, something to think about.
Very much for those comments. Raised a very good point about the Kyoto Protocol. Also having long-term objects, stabilization. The difference with the Paris Agreement, of course, is that Kyoto focused on near-term action, whereas what we now have is an attempt to fudge or to blur the stress on near-term actions by adopting distant long-term goals like net zero. So some of the countries which have had technologically and financially advanced countries which have had no difficulty with adopting a 2050 net zero target have absolutely dreadful emission records over the last decade. I don't want to name countries, that's unnecessary, but I'm sure all of you that this is the case. Now, is there anybody else who wants to take the floor? Or
I just want, with your permission, Ambassador, I just want to add, Archana, this is a normative terminology not given by me. Actually, Jayant Sinha has been talking a lot about net positive, but it's a normative framing. And I like that framing not from the perspective of carbon, but from the perspective of socio-economic benefit that it is going to give. I'll come, Nauroj, I'll give you the chance to speak, but let me just say, so from that perspective. Nauroj, my framing is both from the perspective of how India should negotiate, okay, but also from the perspective of how it should be defined internationally. Okay, it is not only a strategic approach that I'm talking about, but also I believe net zero, we have an advantage of holding developed countries accountable. Net zero, because we will have to see how they're defining it. As you rightly said, upload, whether it's up, they're uploading it, they're going to do it later in the future. Those things are important. But I just want to add, I think one of the very important points, Navroj, you made was, how do we define equity, fairness, as far as the stock taking is concerned, is going to be very important. And one of the recommendations that I would give to TERI, and if it goes to Government of India, is that Government of India should set up some sort of committee or a team or invest in research before the stock take starts, so that we are prepared in terms of taking the stock taking process very seriously. We have not taken the last process very seriously. Okay, so how do we take the 2023 stock taking process very seriously? And one more recommendation that I want to add, that you said that India could announce, speaking of coal-based power plant, is to ban small boilers. It doesn't make any economic sense today. It's just a technology gap. If you go today, electric boilers are cheaper than coal boilers today in Indian market. So it makes sense to ban electric coal boiler, small coal boiler, less than 2 tons per hour. 2 tons per hour is the small one, which gives you huge gain and technology transformation in SME sector. So not only think about large coal-based thermal power plant, but also how do we transform small and medium scale industry is going to be very important. Just wanted to add that recommendation to your recommendation, Navroj. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I thank all the panelists. not only for their very valuable and original contributions, but for keeping to time, for restricting themselves to the time that was allotted to them. I think we've had a very, very constructive exchange of views, and we've set some sort of a record by actually ending on time. There are not many sort of seminars, online or otherwise, in this country in which begin on time and end on time. And I think we've set an example in this respect. And with that, I bring this session to a conclusion, and I hand over to the organizers for summarizing the outcome of. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Master Dasgupta, and all the esteemed panelists for such an insightful and energetic discussion. We'll extend the session by 10 minutes. Shelley, over to you.
Yeah, so I have shared the presentation link, and I think we can just go to the next segment, please.
Okay, thank you. I would like now invite Ambassador Manjeet Puri, Distinguished Fellow TERI, to summarize the discussion and deliver the vote of thanks. Mr. Puri has served as Ambassador of India to the European Union, Belgium, Luxembourg, Nepal, and as Deputy Permanent Representative of India to the UN. From 2005 to 2009, he headed the UN Economic and Social Affairs Division in the Ministry of External Affairs in India. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Anuradha and Nivedita and Shelley. I want to tell you that I don't want to disrupt what Ambassador Dasgupta said, and will try and end this thing within the next 5 minutes so that we stick to this 1:30 schedule that we had. Sir, it was an absolute honor to have you here. And I want to tell Chandrabhushan, Navroz, my dear friend Srinivas from the Ministry of External Affairs, Archana and others, that, we will get together, because I think these are matters that we need to discuss. We will beam them out to everyone, but we should get together in person, because I think some of these matters are extremely important for us as a nation, us as citizens of this nation, and us as citizens of the world. Now, Chandrabhushan, Navroz started off by saying he agreed with what Shelley and I wrote, and then he agreed with you. It's all right. We all know what is going on here. And these are games that not just countries play, these are games that institutions play. That climate action tracker did not change United States from being no good to United States being damn good with nothing at all, anything happening. And Mr. Biden even now is forced to retract on his domestic agenda insofar as climate and this is concerned. And India from very good goes to being zero. No, sir, it doesn't happen like this. I think we should all be mindful. These negotiations are not, Chandrabhushan, about going and grandstanding. That's perfectly fine. And you must do it. We all do it. These negotiations then get down to very hard-boiled business. They are about policy space. Now, you can take the view that I am best off having my policy space constrained. Take the Manish Chaurasia view. That will push a certain direction. People say Japan is a country which believes in not having any policy space. Fine, great. But I think that for a country which will be the largest country in the world within the next 5 years, among the 3 largest economies, and unlikely to have the Japanese business of sliding back to being nothing, we need to have policy space, and we need to know that it's policy space. After that, you can do what you want. Insofar as technologies are concerned, Navroz, you and Chandrabhushan, let me point out to you, I myself have seen, and we are all witness to this, how the cell phone has become ubiquitous with not the richest of the guys, but with the poorest, and how it has benefited them and has benefited all of us too. But the technology is not Indian. Let's understand that very clearly. Look at COVID. Why are we asking that IPRs be lifted worldwide? If we had it all, we would have done it. But that's not the case. I think we should be a little mindful of all of this, of where we stand. And why is it that the world is very much hesitant on the ideas of sharing technologies, etc.? Because things really haven't changed that much. On finance, Manish Chaurasia, me and someone else, we wrote another piece which appeared some weeks back, again in the Hindustan Times, he mentioned many of those points. I think the most critical one for a large developing country like India is actually a level playing field for international finance. Forget this $100 billion and aid finances. They ain't gonna give it to us. But will we have a level playing field? That itself is a matter of doubt. And as he mentions, taxonomies and stuff like that, I think they are particularly important and of great relevance to us. Now, I'll just make one small little point. Chandrabhushan, net zero is not mentioned in 4.1. You can come to that kind of a conclusion if you think so by the use of the words balancing, etc. In any case, net zero for all countries is not mentioned. It is a global goal to be aspired to in the context of the principles of the UNFCCC. And that is exactly what is thought to be buried in Glasgow to the extent possible. And this is something we need to be mindful of. Why do I say so? I'll tell you why I say so. India is a country which, by and large, is a great respecter for what it says and does at the international level. Unlike some of the other countries that we think of, which walk away from their international commitments or feel very strong that you should just throw them out, etc. We don't. We are intrinsically part of the multilateral system, and more than that, our internal dynamics are such that we become bound to these kind of things. Think of judgments of the Supreme Court on so many issues where we are not even treaty members, where we are not even members of the convention, and yet all of them come. Which is why governments in India have traditionally and rightly always taken the view that we must protect our policy space. What we do with it is exactly what you wish to do, what Navroz wants to do, what Archana, what anyone else wants to do. We have to reflect our people and what they wish to have. And I fully understand and agree that development cannot be merely a case of burning coal. There is some logic to balancing power, etc., etc. We all understand, but it can't be one of spewing GHGs and CO2 into the air. We need to be smarter. We need to be more sophisticated. I think there is no doubt. And what can we do about it? We need to do all the action. And if we become global leaders, let me tell you, my entire generation has seen ship to mouth change to India being a net giver. And can you imagine how good I feel? You are younger than me and you have the good fortune of feeling something of a completely different order. And I'm so glad and happy. The kind of gladness that comes to my heart is just of an unbelievable nature. But policy space is particularly important, especially if you recognize the fact that you are going to become the largest country in the world. Most people in India don't think about what it means. We've all grown up being told we are the second largest. When it's second largest, you always take the second position in any line. Become the first largest, the largest. Then you think how it changes your thinking and others' thinking towards you. But I want to stop now. I think it's 1:30. I want to thank Shelly and her team for having put this together. Srinivas, thank you for finding your time and joining us. We would have loved to have had someone from MOEF CC here too, but we were honored by the minister's presence through a video message. I want to promise you this. Chandrabhushan, Navroj, all other colleagues, please join us with TERI. We think it is absolutely important that all of us who believe that we feel a stakeholding in the climate discourse globally and in India, that we come together and try and see what we can do, marrying green, sustainable, and climate interests along with India's developmental aspirations, to which, in my opinion, there can be no backs. Thank you very much. And Shelly, over to you.
Thank you so much. So I think, yes, we are done with the discussion. Is there anything else from your side, Nivedita, Anuradha, that presentation, if you want to just play for the soft launch as we just close?
We just share the screen. Share. I hope you're able to see the screen.
Yeah, excellent.
Yes, can we take it? Okay, so we've got a...
So this is just a symbolic soft launch. I wish, all of you all were here and we could have just held a physical copy of like at least this is just an abstract and key messages from the chapters, and the charter action itself is currently in its final stages, and as Dr. Dhawan mentioned, we will be launching it at a side event in Glasgow, and hopefully our colleagues from TERI will also be there. So please stay tuned and stay in touch with us, and we do hope that we can engage with you more. And also, like as Ambassador Puri mentioned, we do hope to have an in-person event soon, perhaps after the COP, and like plan forward. But then yes, yeah, that's all from my side. Thank you, Anuradha, Nivedita. If there's anything you want to add.
Shelley, let's thank everyone. This has been absolutely superb. And I really want to thank the panelists from Delhi, from other parts of India, and also from overseas. Navroj, if I'm not mistaken, you're somewhere far away from us. But great. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chandrabhushan-ji. Thank you, Ambassador Dasgupta, Archana, as well as Srinivas. Thank you very much for joining.
Navroj, I'll
And
call
Manish,
you.
thanks a ton.